Hello, hello. Hey, Omar. I'm gonna get something to get my laptop higher. All right. Well, that looks more proper. Hello. Let's wait a little bit for people to show up before I start taking the questions. Hello, hello. I'm gonna give it maybe 5 minutes or so because I was a little late and we only have 25 people in the chat right now. Boom, boom, boom. What shampoo do I use? I use whatever's available, whatever's around. I think sometimes just like someone Dove shampoo. I'll do the smart thing and I will actually tweet that from my account. Let's wait another 2 minutes. Actually, 1 minute. There, nicer. All right. All right. Okay, let's get started with this. So I have a list of questions that was pre-submitted. I'm going to go through these, and then after that we can take live questions from the audience. Okay, first question coming from Primates. Can you describe the fundamental nature of the reality we're living in using 100 words or fewer? Is it holographic, a projection, simulation, etc.? I don't. I don't have a strong view here. I don't think we live in a simulation. I think, but I also think reality is instrumental. At the end of the day, it's you build models of the world, and you have useful models of the world and not useful models of the world. I'm not sure that a simulation is a very useful model of the world. So I try to take a pragmatical view to that. Outside of the blockchain category, what technological trends are you interested in following closely? Do you see any of these ultimately being some things that blockchain crosses into? I do follow quite a bit in machine learning and AI. I have a talk from a few years ago where I explained that I think there's very little overlap, or if there is overlap, where it could be. I still think the same thing. It's a talk I gave at CogX. You can find it on YouTube. In general, I'm also interested in financial technology, so obviously that overlaps with blockchains and the crypto sector. But really, outside AI is probably my main center of interest. What are some common sense ways for the Tezos network to decentralize itself that are not currently being practiced? There's a few things. If we're looking in terms of the baking power, for example, maybe having a Windows client can bring in more bakers. But at the end of the day, having a longer tail of small bakers there are some benefits, but really the thing you want is to have a large, you want it to be the case that it takes a large amount of bakers to get to 50%, for example. And so it's really about having more fragmentation among the mid-sized bakers than anything else. And probably, that the question is being asked later, probably getting as much as possible outside of exchanges is probably a common sense thing to do. And the way this happens is the more benefits there are for people to have custody of their Tez, maybe because they interact with applications in DeFi, the more of an incentive they have to go off exchanges. What are three things can bakers do? What are three things can bakers do better as part of their operation within the ecosystem? Probably, I will say testing involvement in testnets is quite useful and important. The second thing I would say is just broadly communicating about the Tezos ecosystem to people outside of the ecosystem. And the third one is upstreaming any problems that they have with their nodes, trying to keep logs, trying to monitor any problems that they may have with their nodes. Sometimes, there are bug reports, and the bug report saying like, oh, well, sometimes I'm missing endorsements, but it's not very precise. And being available to take part in conversation with core developers to try to really track down the problems. So we have a question by Kryptonio about Tezos holdings of exchanges. Looking at Tezos holdings of exchanges, we can see that even though the great ecosystem growth we have seen in the past years, their stake keeps raising. What can be done to keep them from becoming too powerful, and a risk with the network's decentralization and censorship resistance? So I've alluded to that. So I would say even more growth and give people more things to do within this ecosystem. I don't see necessarily exchanges as a major risk for decentralization and censorship resistance, because I think that the exchanges by and large don't really, they don't want to be diluted, so they want to participate in the staking. But because they're known actors, they have very, very strong incentives to not do anything dishonest on the network. So the main fear you have with a blockchain is not so much the censorship of a single actor, it's collusion, right? There's a very big difference between a block producer saying, I am not going to put in certain transactions in my block, and a majority of block producers colluding to exclude transactions from the entire chain. And by and large, I could see exchanges basically censoring blocks, individual blocks. I do not see them participating in collusion to censor the entire chain. Likewise, I don't see them participating in malicious reorganizations of the chain, or trying, for example, to censor a fraud proof. So in terms of the safety of the chain, I don't think it's ideal that the exchanges have a large stake, but I don't think it's not something that's really keeping me up at night. We see a part of the community thinking that DeFi on Tezos hasn't been a big focus as NFTs so far. Do you think that is true? I mean, the chain is going to attract different type of teams, and it's true that a lot more teams have been attracted by the DeFi ecosystem on Tezos, and a lot more people have been attracted to that than have been attracted to DeFi. There are a few teams building DeFi on Tezos, but by and large, there hasn't been a whole lot of activity. Why do you think that has happened? I would say preferential attachment is one thing. If you have a big NFT community, it attracts more people. The other thing is that there was essentially a play starting at the end of 2020 and into 2021. So if you look at the emergence of DeFi and Ethereum in 2020, a lot of it comes from projects who basically don't want to be giving X% of their tokens to Binance so that they can be listed and so they can have liquidity. So what they found out instead is that, hey, they could go on Uniswap, they could do liquidity farming, and all of a sudden they have a way to launch their token and have the token be traded and have the token be liquid. That's the origin. It was perverted very quickly when it just became like pure staking and yield games, which don't really make any sense, but that's the original use case. And there was a game to be played here, which was bridge the assets from Ethereum into another chain, which is not going to have as much latency, which is not going to have expensive transactions, and then do the DeFi there. And several chains tried this game, and Binance Smart Chain was one of the first one here. And my general thinking was that Binance was essentially going to win this game. The reason being that, well, one, they had EVM compatibility. So it's very easy to take any DeFi project on Ethereum, copy paste it on Binance, which developers have done. The second thing is that they were quite centralized, so it's easy for them to show low latency and high throughput, even though they don't actually really do that, but in theory they can. And three is that by virtue of being attached to Binance, they have this easy ability to bridge, because Binance is a custodian of the funds of its customers. And as a custodian, it essentially has all the operational security that's needed to custody assets, so to operate a bridge. And it is, the security of bridges has been neglected. You've seen a lot of hack bridges. Essentially, they are in the business of doing this type of custody. So they were very well positioned. And I'm surprised they didn't actually take more of that flow. I don't think Tezos was very well positioned at the end of 2020 and beginning of 2021 to do that. One, because we didn't have EVM compatibility, so you can't just tell developers go and copy your DeFi application on Tezos. And second, because we also didn't. So that also implies the MetaMask activity, and we didn't have any particular good bridge. But also, I didn't think anyone would be competitive with Binance Smart Chain in doing that. There's several chains that have been. We've seen quite a bit on Polygon and Avalanche, who basically tried this playbook. The way they did it is basically offer EVM compatibility, low latency, but also I think that they paid a lot of money to bring liquidity on the chain. So they had basically companies or foundations attached to them that basically went to different DeFi teams and said, look, we'll pay you X amount of dollars for each dollar of TVL that you bring to the chain. They're not the only one that did this. So Algorand, for example, is not EVM, and Algorand had some success in doing that by paying a lot of money. Ultimately, I don't know how sustainable that is. Once you start paying, essentially a lot of the TVL goes away. What it does is that I think what they got out of it, rather than TVL, is user acquisition. So if a lot of users in the crypto space are used to doing yield farming and all these other things, they will migrate to a chain that does it, and maybe you have some sticky user acquisition. It doesn't really do developer acquisition because it's just copy paste. So I'm not really certainly it's been rewarded in the markets, which it's not obvious why, because I don't know how sticky this type of activity is or how much value it drives for the chain underneath. But I think mostly that's what happened. So we see another question about DeFi by Kryptonio. We see part of the community thinking that DeFi and Tezos has no. Sorry, that's the same question. Question by CryptoStack. I would like to hear how can the community or TF bring more liquidity to Tezos, assuming we need liquidity for DeFi 2.0. So there's two kinds of liquidity. I don't know if you mean liquidity for Tez itself or liquidity for the type of token that trade on Tez. For the type of token that trade on Tez, there's a couple things. One is that you can just have if you're launching a DeFi project, you can say, look, I'll pay in tokens to bring liquidity for this. But there's a lot of very low-hanging fruits that no one's really picked. So, for example, I wrote a contract back last summer for a stable swap type of contract if you want to swap two stable coins or something of the sort. And that gives you a lot more liquidity than using Uniswap. And no one deployed it for nearly a year. So you want to pay liquidity. The idea is that somehow paying for liquidity is just going to solve all problems. I don't quite buy it. I would buy it a lot more in an environment where when code is available to have something that's a lot more liquid, then people use it. But we're not in that environment. There's also, as far as I know, there's two implementations of the Uniswap v3 paper in the world. There's the one done by Uniswap v3, which is not fully open source. And there's one that I wrote, which is available with a front end. And none of the DeFi team on Tezos has actually launched it or tried to use it. And you get a lot more liquidity in Uniswap v3 with the Uniswap v3 type of DEX than you do with the regular one. So the bigger question is why isn't that happening? And if you're not picking the very, very low hanging fruits, I don't know that it makes sense to get a taller ladder and go pick and go pick other fruits. So if you want to know how the community can bring more liquidity, I would say use those tools that are available. Use those contracts. I think that they can bring a ton of liquidity by themselves. What are the possibility solutions for improving UX when using Tezos, including speed, RPC, and tooling reliability? Another question by CryptoStack. So in terms of improving UX, the question seems to refer specifically to the node, not necessarily the UX that people are building around their dApp. So speed and RPC, that's a long process. There's a lot that's been improved in a Tezos node. It's not a node that's been built initially specifically for performance, but it's improved dramatically over the past 2 years. And improvements like the multi-core support in the node should bring a lot of performance. In terms of the tooling, again, the tooling also has enormously improved. I think it's a process of keeping improving and getting some feedback. One thing that makes it easier today to develop the tooling around Tezos is that there's a bigger developer community that can actually give feedback on the tools that they need and that they want to use. Will it be possible to have a rollup compatible with other chains outside EVM? Asks Devil May. So one thing to understand is that an EVM is not a chain. EVM is a virtual machine, right? So it's just a set of instructions. That's how you execute contracts. So if you have an EVM rollup, you're not compatible with the Ethereum network specifically. You're compatible with contracts that have been written for the Ethereum network. So likewise, we can have rollup compatible with other virtual machines. I don't know that there's too many out there that have been very popular. I think Solana uses eBPF, so it's not too hard to have an eBPF style rollup and use that tooling. The REST tooling that they have. In general, I think that WASM is also like a generically good target for a smart contract VM for a rollup. It's been used in a few projects. Near is using it. Cosmos WASM is using it. Internet Computer is using it. So probably I would say there's like three type of virtual machine you want in rollups. You want an EVM one for legacy. You want a WASM one for genericity, and then you want a Michelson one for compatibility with the Tezos stack. On the question about crypto stack, how could we further incentivize baking and voting on Tezos? There's a couple of things that can be done. For the voting part, I thought it was interesting because I think Algorand introduced a concept that said like that penalized people for not voting. And the way that Coinbase reacted was to say like, okay, we'll vote, but we'll defer our vote to the Algorand Foundation or something like that. So it is possible to it is possible to nudge in this way exchanges to actually vote. In general, most of the scheme that I've seen, the difficulty that I see is that they kind of incentivize people to just automatically vote pass, and you don't want to incentivize that. You want to force people to look at it and make a decision. So that's one possibility to actually like introduce a small penalty. Maybe you lose a cycle of block production, but I don't think it's going to lead to exchanges actually making decisions. I think that it leads to exchanges delegating decisions to other parties. To further incentivize baking, I think having better baking software, having Windows baking software, for example, that's a thing. But honestly, I don't think that Tezos suffers from lack of baking. There's 400 bakers, and it's easy to look at this metric and say we need to do better. But by and large, this is not among all the metrics that I look at for Tezos, this is far from being at the top. I care a lot more about the active number of wallets on a given week. I care a lot more about the number of active dApps which are on Tezos. I care a lot more about the number of companies or startups using Tezos. Those are much more relevant metrics to our success than baking and voting, which isn't to say that it's not to say that baking and voting aren't important, but I think we're actually doing quite well on those metrics. So I would rather focus on the metrics of adoption rather than baking, if anything. CryptoStack asks, is there a possibility that we'll have TF put more funds in the power of the community? Meaning community deciding which projects to fund using some of the TF war chest. So generally speaking, Swiss foundations, they have a lot of flexibility so long as they follow their goals. But one of the things that they cannot do is they cannot delegate decision-making power. So they have to, which if you give a grant, you're not going to, of course, oversee every single decision of the grantee in terms of, what type of pencils are they buying or anything like that. But you cannot give money to an organization and say, do whatever you think is good for the Tezos ecosystem. You can't really do that. But in general, I would love to see more community-driven projects and fundings. We have way of funding things on chain. I think there's a demonstration of that with liquidity baking. So funding DAOs on a chain is completely possible, and I think should be tried. And I will also say that it will demonstrate that operating a DAO and actually having the DAO interface with real-world actors is a lot trickier than people imagine. What Richard Ayod asked, what killer app is currently missing from the Tezos ecosystem? Lending. I would say that we have some form of, you can kind of lend with Use, for example, or with Scalability. You could issue a stable coin against your collateral and then sell the stable coin, and essentially you've got something similar to a loan, but it doesn't work with every single form of collateral. So something very generic that lets you take any collateral and borrow anything else around against it, which is something that Checker does. I think that's missing. I also think that some financialization around NFTs is also missing, and because we have a lot of assets in the NFT space, then that would be quite useful. I don't know that there's a killer app. So I think it's about doing doing some applications and doing them very, very well. Are there any other tools integration in the pipeline you can share? No, I mean, so I can tell you what's been announced, but I wouldn't make any announcements by myself on an AMA. I don't think that would be appropriate. Am I currently working on any other project within Tezos apart from CTES? Well, CTES is a thing that I wrote a while back, so I'm not working on CTES. I just like following it, but it works by itself. Like CTES has no governance. CTES doesn't have anything like that. It's mathematical, but it works quite well. It's been fairly stable for the past months now, and you should check it out if you have not checked out CTES. Currently, the drift for CTES is about twice the baking reward. So I think that I will believe that CTES has been fully understood once the drift is closer to the baking reward as opposed to twice the baking reward. But it is a useful primitive for any type of wrapping. And of course, there's many ways you can wrap Tez. Most of them are centralized in some ways, and I think with CTES is that it's a decentralized wrapped Tez, which is important to have. Look, I'm not going to stop anyone from making the wrap version of Tez. But if the grand vision is that all of DeFi on Tez is going to use a wrap Tez, then it shouldn't be a centralized one. I think that's pretty obvious. Any ideas on where Tezos could be implemented and utilized the most in the near future? Well, one of the things that I do like is, and I've talked about this in interviews, is trying to get some traditional finance involved in DeFi. Right now, there's a bit of an impedance mismatch, and it's a little difficult. But if we can tokenize real-world assets and make it easy for small and medium businesses who do STOs to have access to liquidity, to have access to loans, that's a pretty strong value prop. I'm bleeding into the next question, which is what about STOs? Are you aware of any teams working on Tezos build STOs now? Yes, there's some STOs going on Tezos, but I would say that so far the value prop for an STO has been, hey, it's easier to manage your cap table, and it's easier for your investors to be able to move their shares or to use some centralized exchanges like T0. But I think the value prop becomes much more compelling once you start composing this with AMMs, Uniswap style AMMs or lending. Do I think that in the near future, the biggest projects that are on Tezos, for example, Togami, will all have their own rollup, possibly also an NVM compatible in order to have a bridge to other chains? No, I don't think that, and it's a thing that often comes up when I talk about rollup. I will often hear, "Oh, you can do this, you can do that," and I don't see it. I don't think you need to be application specific in order to. I don't buy the application specific rollups, the application specific parrot chain, the application specific Cosmos chain. That doesn't really make sense to me. You have a little less overhead if you do that. But people get this idea that somehow they get this form of encapsulation out of doing it, and I think it's misguided. I think of rollups not so much as an encapsulation solution, but rather as a scaling solution. In fact, rollups do both horizontal scaling and vertical scaling, and that means essentially that you can run a rollup on a very, very powerful machine and only need one honest person running the rollup on a powerful machine. So that changes the equation in terms of decentralization. With the validators of a chain, bakers, you want it to be fairly lightweight to validate, but for a rollup, it's okay to have much stronger requirements, which means that with a single rollup, you can already have a lot of processing power and a lot of throughput. And then combine that with the fact that you can use multiple rollups in parallel, and then you have a lot of scaling. But I think that's all you need. I don't think we're going to. I mean, sorry. Are we going to see application-specific rollups? Yes, absolutely, because people are going to believe that it's important and useful for them to have application-specific optimistic rollups. Does it make a whole lot of sense to have them? I don't think so. I think people will do it for marketing reason or because they convince themselves that it's useful. But I don't think there's a lot of value in doing application-specific rollups as opposed to just having general computing rollups and using those. It's different for ZK rollup. For ZK rollup, because combining proofs is so high, we'll see application-specific ZK rollups. Lot less for optimistic. Do you think in the near future the biggest project around? Sorry, that's what's the most important step we could take as a community to help bring on the next wave of developers and builders onto Tezos? I would say advocacy, and a lot of developers who come into this ecosystem realize the support and realize the community. So I would say to keep that going. Also to educate people. A lot of people don't necessarily know what's going on Tezos. They haven't heard about it. They don't know about all the application that they are, about the size of the developer community, where the tools are, all of this. So in general, I would say advocacy, communication, information, hand-holding. Why are there not that many existing projects from other chains adopting Tezos, and how can we bring them on? For example, Curve, Cautious Bridges, and so on and so forth. Well, I would, first of all, a lot of these projects are built in Solidity. They compile to EVM. So for them, the cost of going onto Tezos as opposed to going on an EVM compatible chain is high. They have to basically rewrite their code base. So I think they just do a cost benefit analysis here. I think we have better chances of attracting new projects coming onto Tezos with new developers rather than the one which are already there. To monitor the progress of this integration that have been announced, and the best step to push through, example USDC, OpenSea. Yeah, so there is a business model which is to get a grant and then decide if you want to integrate or not, and then have some sort of like free option and free funding. It's difficult, but that's the state of the industry right now. A lot of people treat this as if this was a one-shot game and don't really care about reputation. So I would say maybe make people care about reputation would be important, and also perhaps I would think the foundation should do a better job of announcing integration grants when they happen. Have a list maybe on the website so that people can actually follow up on them and remind the companies who are doing integration that they're committed to something and they should actually do it. We have a question from Peggy. Do you perceive the gap between blockchain startups and traditional business shrinking, or is there still a reluctance of traditional business to integrate blockchain technology? Not sure exactly what that refers to. I mean, we've seen a lot of traditional businesses use some forms of blockchain technology or even public chains, and we see a lot of startups. I don't think that we're going to see immediately a lot of large businesses just jumping ahead in DeFi, for example, in its current form. I think they have stronger compliance requirements, and I think until they're addressed, they're not going to be taking part in this. But I do think they can be addressed, and there's an opportunity here. And another question: any thought on how to capture a wider user base for Tezos and other blockchains in general? In general, it's a bit of a flywheel. You want to build some compelling application which brings some users, and then the users use the application, and then they use another application. Now you have more users. The more users you have, the more developers are attracted to the platform because it has users, and those you build more applications, more users. So it's a cycle that needs to that you need to really start and keep going. The nice thing is that we're starting to have this in NFTs with people naturally coming to the ecosystem, launching new projects, bringing users, and people launch now NFT projects on Tezos because it has NFT collectors, and NFT collectors come on Tezos because it has some NFTs to collect. So that's basically the mechanism you want to get going. Tezos has from the outset gone for a fully decentralized approach. Do you think this held the blockchain back from attracting more users? And would the decentralized tech with decentralized non-tech aspects have been more effective? I mean, I don't really see the value of having a centralized blockchain. And for me, the decentralization is all about technology anyway. So, it is a decentralized technology. So I'm not exactly sure what the question means. If the question means having a centralized entity pretend that the chain is not decentralized and, say, call itself Tezos, and creates basically an amalgam between centralized entities and the chain. I know I don't think it's held it back. Ethereum had consensus. Consensus never pretended to be Ethereum, but that worked well enough for them. The main thing that some tokens have done in recent years has been that when Tezos launched, it was basically an anathema for a foundation or a company or anything like that to keep more than a few percent of the tokens. But now you have chains launching where 90% of the supplies, 95% of the supply is held by VCs. So you'll see things with, you'll see this type of like tiny floats with chains like Near or Solana. It gives them a lot of power because they basically have all these tokens that they can tap into for future funding very easily, and no one cares about the float. That's one of the things that people happen. So people look at a cryptocurrency or project and they say, I want to allocate 100K to this, or I want to allocate 10K to this. So now collectively you look at everyone, and maybe collectively a bunch of people are going to say, I want to put, collectively they want to put $50 million into it, and you have 1% float. So the result is that you end up with a 5 billion market cap. Now you might say, but these people might say 5 billion is too high. That's not what's going to happen. On the opposite, they're going to see the high market cap and they're going to say, it's successful. So, that justifies the fact that I've allocated to that. So this is a phenomenon where basically having a tiny float is actually quite helpful, because people basically don't project themselves into thinking what will happen when the float gets bigger, which does eventually happen. Any thoughts on how to capture a wider user base for Tezos and other blockchains in general? No, I've answered that already. The NFT market is maturing more towards utilities and pure art. Do you see this become more and more prevalent, and how will that affect the large artist population on Tezos? I do not buy this at all. I think there's a few use cases for NFT which are interesting, but the idea is that an NFT is so much better when it has utility. The problem is that someone has to give you the utility. The blockchains are at best when they're actually like solving a problem by eliminating trust. And if I am sending you a piece of art, that's a piece of art. I have it. There's a little bit of a trust component in the sense, I might want to check the origin, I want to check the source, but I can check those things. Same thing with payments. This whole thing with utility is like, I'll give you a token, I'll give you an NFT, and it has utility, but who's giving me the utility? And if there's a central party who's responsible for giving me utility, why isn't it just maintaining a database? So I actually have far more faith in the pure art use case than I have as a utility use case. I don't know if tokens that are part of video games are going to be considered to have, to be utility NFTs. I do think there's a lot of value with those. I think they make a lot of sense, because virtual goods in video games have had secondary markets for a long time, and making them more organized and better available on a blockchain makes a ton of sense to me. So gaming is going to be a thing. So is art. But the idea is that your NFT unlock, access to a bar or access to a party is, concert tickets as NFT, for example, everyone talks about that, and I think there's a value insofar as like people might want to keep the stub from their tickets like as a collector. But in terms of like the experience of just admitting people inside a concert hall, I don't think there's a whole lot of value here. Richard asks, what feature do you wish the Tezos protocol had? Well, I wish it had all the features which are being built right now, because we wouldn't have to build them. So I wish it had a data availability sampling layer, and I wish it had protocol level support for rollups. But that might come. That might take a year for all this to come together. But that's what I wish it had. But there's a few things. I think having post conditions on transactions would be quite helpful. So you do a transaction, and then you specify a bit of Michelson code that's going to run against the receipt of your transaction. And what that lets you do is it would let you interact with untrusted smart contracts. You go to a smart contract, you don't know what it is, it's on a shady website, but you say, look, I'm willing to interact with this so long as it's not going to take any of my tokens that I own, period. you could actually do that with a post condition on your transactions, and that's not available in any other cryptocurrencies, as far as I know. And it's hard to you can't easily implement that in Ethereum, for example, because you could implement a post condition that goes and check every single token you own. That would be too slow. Whereas if the chain returns to you, we have this ticket receipt, and you have code that parses this ticket receipt and actually says, I'm going to throw the transaction if it actually has any impact on my balances. That's a nice feature that I haven't seen in anywhere else. What feature do you wish Tezos wallets had? Tezos wallets have most of the features that I would like them to have. I think having better support for multi-sig would be useful. Better support for sapling, but right now I haven't seen a lot of demand for missing features in terms of Tezos wallets. I think being more reliable in general, the beacon collection, and I know it's not clear if it's a dApp, if it's beacon, if it's a wallet, but more reliability in terms of dApp connection with wallets would be quite helpful. From my point of view, what can we do or say as non-developer community members to help inspire developers' adoption for building on Tezos? I think you could tell Tezos why you're passionate. You could tell them why you're passionate about Tezos and the type of application that you're looking forward to use as a user. How can we incentivize more people to bake on Tezos? Should we consider increasing baking rewards? So again, I really don't think that having more bakers on Tezos, having more bakers on Tezos is a great thing. By all means, we should have more bakers on Tezos. I don't think there's any immediate benefits in having more bakers on Tezos. There's a lot of things which are far more beneficial than that. I've already mentioned how to get people, I think, having easier setup. Increasing baking rewards will not incentivize more people to bake on Tezos, because what will happen if you increase the baking reward is that the bakers are just going to end up passing more to their delegates, right? Because bakers are looking and say, okay, do I cover my cost or do I not cover my cost? And if I can cover more than my cost because I was giving back 90% to the delegates, and now all of a sudden the baking reward is higher, maybe I'm giving back 92%. So for a short period of time before those rates adjust, it would be more profitable for bakers. But very, very soon, they would you would go back to a competitive equilibrium. So I don't think it would be useful to do that. How would you respond to people who criticize Tezos' low Nakamoto coefficient? For those who don't know, the Nakamoto coefficient is the minimum number of parties that need to collude to break the consensus algorithm. Yeah, well, I would say that first of all, I would commend them for actually looking at those numbers. It's an important number to look at, and I would say a more important number than the number of bakers. One of the things we do in Tezos is that there's no incentive for splitting your stake. There's a lot of blockchain that incentivize people to split their stake, and that's a way to hide the real Nakamoto numbers. So they do this in Cardano, for example, where by limiting the size of the stake. The most extreme example is Ethereum 2.0, where they call everyone with 32 ETH a validator. But even with even on a chain like Solana, for example, they do it in a very subtle manner. They have this website where you can look at the list of all the potential people you can delegate with. And then they draw a line at 1/3, and they say, don't delegate to these people because they already represent 1/3 of the network. Go below that line. So that sounds like a very clever way of increasing your Nakamoto coefficient. But what it does do is that if I'm a delegate, if I'm a validator and I am in the top third, all of a sudden I'm not on a website. So that gives me an incentive for actually creating two validators, which I'm going to control, and which now are going to be displayed to users. So the problem is that as soon as you try educating users and saying like, hey, you should be careful, pick a baker which doesn't have too much staking power, you're giving an incentive to the bakers to kind of stabilize the network. I think there's a sweet spot in the sense of like, if you educate users a little bit, it's going to have an effect, but it's not going to have an effect that's big enough that bakers are going to bother setting up multiple operations to try to appear as more than one. But it's it's kind of like it's it's trying to grasp water in some sense. It's like you can push, but as soon as you push too much, bakers will just split their stakes, and you're not going to get to get much. I would say that the main thing to do is to focus on making that number irrelevant, and that's one of the philosophies that I like in Ethereum in their design compared to a lot of other chains, is that they focus very very much on consensus attack being survivable, so that you basically it's just okay. A dishonest majority can stop the system, but it cannot steal the money from everyone. It cannot rewrite past transaction. It cannot do all of these things. And there's many ways. You take a chain like Polkadot, for example, and you look at the ways that they do data availability, and that might have changed, but that gives a ton more power to validators. And so the consequences of having a dishonest majority are far worse than if you have smaller assumptions. That comes up with optimistic rollups, for example. So in an optimistic rollup, if someone makes an invalid commitment, you need to inject a refutation of that. Naively, you might think that 1/3 of the bakers can block the refutation from ever being put in place, but actually it takes 2/3. So if you have 2/3 dishonest and you have optimistic rollups, the 2/3 dishonest can start stealing from the rollup. So now 2/3 is much better than 1/3, including with the Nakamoto coefficient. But you can do even better. You can make sure that withdrawal delays are long enough that people even have the time to coordinate the hard fork, for example, in between. So my answer to the Nakamoto coefficient, rather than trying to push for having as much validators as possible, which I think is a losing. I think it's a losing game. It's healthy to have many, but you can't really depend on that. You want to build your chain in a way that even if you have a dishonest majority, you're fine. Dishonest majority might cause some temporary disruption in the network, but not be able to steal fund or not cause more issues. Recently, bugs were found during the Jakarta update proposal. Do you think Tezos should upgrade less frequently in order to make sure upgrades can include more features, cause less pressure on the ecosystem to constantly update and receive further testing? I think it would be great if we could do this, but honestly, I think no. It's quite important to scale as soon as possible because of the competitive pressure of the space. I think if it's a bit of the innovator's dilemma, right? If you're in a position, if you're a market leader in terms of your positioning and market size, you want to be very very cautious about all of these things. If you're a challenger, you actually want to take more. You want to move faster and take a bit more risk. So despite that, I do think it's better to try to upgrade quickly. At the very least, get the chain to the point where it can have arbitrary optimistic rollup and a data availability sampling layer, and then you can have a lot of work that actually goes into the rollup, and a lot of the work that's happening on layer one can basically take a big break and focus more on testing once we have some form of scaling in the chain than currently. It's a difficult trade-off, of course, but I think it's a right equilibrium. Can I talk about the growth I've seen with the Tezos community and what other directions you'd like to see it go in? Well, a ton of growth in the NFT space and in the developer community around Tezos. So that's been great. I'd like to see more, we've talked about DeFi. I'd like to see more teams popping up and bringing DeFi to Tezos. A lot of the stuff that I've seen in DeFi has, there's a lot of copies of Uniswap and different variants. I would love to see a little more. There's more interesting primitives that can be built than Uniswap. Gaming also is a big interesting direction. I think we should. I'd love to see a lot more games on a Tezos chain. So they can be play-to-earn games. They can be collectible card games, or any type of or 3D environments. I think the sky's the limit in terms of what you can imagine here. What kind of other presence do you wish Tezos had? Are there many specific markets or spaces that I'd like to see Tezos break into? I think I mentioned them. So basically, arts, gaming, and DeFi, and specifically having a DeFi that's compatible with institutional players. All right, so now we're going to some of the live questions that have been collected. So how are enshrined rollups better than non-enshrined rollups in terms of rollup interoperability? Well, there are benefits to enshrined rollups. I don't think the gains you have are in terms of interoperability, in terms of interop. So the first gain you have is that you don't have to write your rollup in a smart contract language. You can actually write it in a better language where you have more tooling. So I think it's easier to write secure code for your rollup if you're building an enshrined rollup. Second one is that you get a little more performance out of it. Although I would say much of the performance comes during challenges, and those challenges are not really supposed to happen. The third one, I think, is that it can act as a very strong selling point for the ecosystem, where everyone kind of agrees that, hey, everyone, we should be using that rollup, and that rollup should get the attention of wallets, and that rollup should get the attention of indexers. So merely acting as a coordination, merely being part of the protocol, I think, makes you a coordination point. It can also come with more specific expectations from actors. So I mentioned earlier that you might think that one third can censor a fraud proof in a rollup, but it's actually 2/3. Let me explain why. So imagine that someone makes a fake commitment to optimistic rollup. They come in and they post a state of the rollup, but it's actually wrong. And then they bribe 1/3 of the validators into thinking, okay, you're 1/3 because we have 10 to bake, 1/3 can censor. So you tell this 1/3, okay, you guys should start censoring transactions. Do not include the fraud proof. So at first it might seem like, okay, well, you're going to have a safety failure because they can let the rollup be finalized and someone can extract the funds from the rollup this way. But actually, if you only have 1/3, then the rest, the other 2/3 are going to be honest, and they can notice then that something is going wrong. So if you notice that a rollup fraud proof is not being included, as an honest participant, or if you notice that the chain is being censored, you can stop the chain. So 1/3 honest can 1/3 of the honest validator can decide that they're seeing censorship. They're seeing the censorship being used for a safety attack, and they want to stop the chain. So in that case, you basically have 1/3 can trigger a liveness failure, but that's already the case. But they cannot trigger a safety failure on rollups. So you need 2/3 dishonest to trigger a safety failure on the rollups. This is all very complicated, sorry. But my point here is that if the rollup is just someone's smart contract, someone's project running like this, it's not clear for me what the behavior of honest validators should be. Whereas if it's enshrined, I think it's a lot easier to have norms in the community, so that if someone tries to, if 1/3 of the network is dishonest and tries to censor a fraud proof for an honest rollup, then honest nodes should actually stop the chain to prevent that from happening. That is, I think, one of the benefits you get from enshrined rollups. What's my take on exchange following sanctions on Russia? It is against the ethos of the industry. I don't even think it's a matter of ethos, because as an exchange you have no choice but to comply with so the laws where you're operating it. I mean, your choice is either that or completely falling down. And if you're completely falling down, then you're not just going to follow sanction on Russia, you're going to be sanctioning everyone. So I don't really think sanctions have a choice. Exchanges have a choice. The ethos of the industry is decentralization. Exchanges are by their nature centralized actor, and centralized actors are going to be subject to these different rules. So I think it's normal that exchanges comply, because the alternative is that they just simply don't exist. Now, if the law was requiring exchanges to hunt down their customers and maim them, obviously I don't think they should comply, right? They are unjust laws that you have a duty to actually resist. But I don't think this is one of them, because if you resist it, you're just going to be out of business anyway. Tezos TVL is pretty low compared to other networks. How do you explain that? Last time I checked, it was around $82 million or something like that. I don't know the exact number. I think it's a little higher than that. because just liquidity peaking alone, I think, has something like 25 million. But the reason the TVL is pretty low, I would say, because there hasn't been a thriving DeFi community on Tezos. There hasn't been hundreds of millions spent on boosting the TVL. Again, like I think it's still an open question whether or not it's worth boosting the TVL, spending money to temporarily boost the TVL, and I would say lack of compelling use cases for users. You need to present something that's not easily accessible to users on other chains, and I think that just replicating what's going on isn't going to be a winning game, because you could say, go and trade your Ethereum tokens on Tezos because A, it's cheap to wrap them, and two, there's a ton of liquidity on the chain. And so people might raise them and go and trade them here. The question is, like, once the liquidity dries up, do they actually stay there, or do they just move to the next venue that's actually paying them? What are the odds Coinbase NFT will integrate Tezos NFTs? Well, we talked to the Coinbase team, but I can't comment on discussions. And I think that one thing that I can say for sure is that Coinbase listens to its customer base, and so if you're an NFT consumer, if you make if you collect NFTs or if you make NFTs, you should definitely talk to Coinbase and let them know that you're looking forward to integration. If you're just a Tezos fan and you just tell them they should use Tezos and you're not actually a collector, they might pay less attention. But if you're an artist in the space, by all means, talk to them. How do I explain to a layperson that Michelson is more secure than his Ethereum virtual machine? Because it was built, it was built differently. The Ethereum virtual machine is built as a very low-level assembly that's trying to be very, very generic. Michelson is also an assembly, but it's higher level and it's easier to make proof about. So what I would explain is that it's Michelson is a language that's closer to what programmers or mathematicians use to describe programming concepts, as opposed to the Ethereum virtual machine, which is very myopically just moves bytes around. But I don't necessarily think that the layperson is going to be. I don't necessarily see the value in talking to the layperson and telling them Michelson is more secure than the Ethereum virtual machine. And first of all, because it's completely possible to write a secure contract in ZVM and an insecure contract in Michelson, right? So I think it can help. But it's not it's obviously not a silver bullet. Can you explain how tickets will interact with rollups and who will be running rollup nodes? That's a great question. So tickets are going to be used as a communication mechanism for rollups. That's how you bridge rollup and the L1. You have assets in the L1. You want to send them to the rollup. You put them in a ticket. Send the ticket. Likewise, you want to withdraw from the rollup, you get a ticket. But ticket is more general than an asset. It could be any type of permission, any type of message. It's a really nice communication primitive between the L1 and the L2. In terms of who will be running the rollup nodes, that's a good question. So there's not an easy, because anyone can be running a rollup node. It's a little difficult to incentivize running the rollup node. On a traditional blockchain, basically you're going to say, look, there's a certain amount of stake, everyone has a bit of stake, and then if you have stake, you produce a block, and then you get rewarded for that. But there's no such concept of stake in a rollup because we don't need an honest majority. We just need one person running the rollups. So who will be running rollup nodes? My guess is people who care about applications inside the rollups. So if you are a gaming company and you have a game running in a rollup, you're going to run a rollup node because you have an interest in your game running well. And the reason why I'm confident this is possible is because the cost of running a rollup node is quite low compared to the amount of economic activities that can happen in a rollup. If you're talking about a cost of, I don't know, exaggerating, right? But like $10,000 per year would be, I think, an upper bound on how much it costs to run a very, very beefy rollup node. If you can't find one person, one honest party to spend that much to protect what's going on inside the rollups, then I don't think anyone has has a vested interest. There could be you could imagine like a free rider problem where everyone has a vested interest inside in the rollup, uh, but no one wants to spend it because they expect someone else will spend it. And I think that's credible if it's a very large cost. But then when it's a very small cost, there's going to be a single actor who has enough of a stake or enough of an incentive inside this network to actually run a node. How does Taurus work? Well, we have something like Bakers for it that process for faster transactions. Oh, Taurus, no, not Taurus. We have something like Bakers for it that processes the faster transaction and how is it incentivized. So Taurus is just one simple type of optimistic rollups. It's a nice way to introduce the concept on the chain, but it's going to be fairly it's going to be rendered much more general with the scorers, smart contract optimistic rollups. So they're optimistic rollups that only do transactions. And to the question, will we have something like Bakers? It's exactly like the rollup nodes. Essentially, you rely on the fact that there's a party that cares enough about what's happening inside the Tor to run it, and people should only use it if they are confident enough that there are indeed at least one honest party running it. But it's not like a blockchain where you need basically hundreds of different parties running it for security. You need just only a single honest party, and so that's a lot easier to find. What is the interest of brands to come to Tezos on their own initiative? So that's happened quite a bit. We've seen a few brands, for example, like Gap or Evian, do drops on their own initiative on Tezos chain. I think it's probably the branding of Tezos is useful. The developer experience, the integration, the simple integration of wallets like Kukai. All of these, I think, make for a compelling experience. And also, they see other brands having success with it, and they say like, okay, such other brand did it on Tezos, it went well. We should do it on Pesos as well. Charles asks, what do you wish you knew in 2017 that you know now? Oh, I mean, this question is either it's both too easy and too hard because you can answer that you would you wish to know the detailed price move of every single asset in the world for the past 4 years. 5 years, and then you can use that to you can convert that knowledge into money, and then you can convert that money into the pursuit of any goals that you're after. But that's the cheating answer. I wish I knew more about the design of scaling. I think the ideas around scaling in 2017 weren't as clear as they are now. So having had like a very, very clear idea on how to scale back then, we could have scaled much earlier. So that would have been quite helpful. And there's a bunch of other things. I don't want to go into all these things like if only I had known. But yeah, so many things. But if you knew back then what you know now, you can take anything that's been innovative and transformative and then just do it before anyone else. What other chains do you find interesting? I think Ethereum 2.0, if anyone in chips, is an interesting design, although it keeps evolving. Among the chains that I like, interesting designs. Polkadot, Near are interesting. I don't know what Cosmos is doing in terms of shared security. I do think shared security is interesting. That's mostly it. I like Zcash, of course, and the focus on privacy, which I don't think is at the center of many projects today. Arthur, what do you think Tezos is doing better than other chains to strive and survive? Well, I don't know how central it is to striving and surviving, but one thing that I can say is that it's focusing a lot more on things which are real. And it's a compliment that I get often, is that Tezos is no nonsense. Tezos doesn't do any of the bullshit, right? So I'll give you an example. There was a time where the Ohm project came out and everyone had the 3.3, and I looked at Ohm and I looked at it for about 10 minutes and I was like, this is stupid and this is not going to work. And at the same time, I had a ton of people saying, why don't we have Ohm on Tezos? Ohm is the future, blah blah blah. You don't get it. So would we, if I had believed that this was a future and so important, maybe I would have pushed. Maybe I would have tried to like attract some teams, talk to the home teams, get something like this on Tezos. I could have maybe tipped the scale in the direction of getting a project like this on Tezos, and I didn't. And as a result, you can see the result positively in a sense of like we didn't have an exciting project that attracted people, but we also didn't have a really stupid project that was really brain dead from the beginning. So it's again, like I'm not sure to which extent it's useful for thriving or surviving, but I would say that what we're doing better is credibility. Any comment on Luna UST sustainability? Well, on that topic, on the features of Rune and Sourcechain. So, I mean, on the one hand, you can't argue with success. People are going to say like, well, look at the Luna market cap. Clearly they've been very successful. So, but I think they've been very successful as in terms of marketing or in terms of like business development and trying to position themselves with respect to other chains and creating a zeitgeist around it. Now, if you ask me from a financial perspective, does UST make sense? Absolutely not. And does it make sense now that they're backing it by Bitcoin? Absolutely not. But so the general idea of Luna and UST is that they say, look, we have an oracle from our validators that's going to tell us the price of Luna in dollars, and we're just going to mint coins by having anyone to come to the chain can burn some of the Luna and get some UST, or burn some of the UST and get some Luna, and we do that at the price, which is the current oracle. And there you go, stablecoin, and we'll pay some interest rate. Now, the first question you should ask yourself is like, where is interest rate coming from? Like, who's actually paying that? And if you think about it, it's the Luna holders. So Luna holders, they hold this thing, and it gets converted at a certain price, and then it gets converted with an interest at a later point. So you might say like, well, why do holders want to subsidize people holding UST at 20%? It's like, well, maybe because it looks good for their ecosystem, and as a result, it transfers in higher market cap. Which in terms of narrative might work for a while, but it's not something that's really sustainable. So you're basically paying for, and if most of the supply is just held by people who want to collect 20%, then essentially the supply is not being used. So you're basically having your L1 token holders pay for, bribe people for holding a stable coin, which they don't really want to hold in the first place. The second thing is that there's no direct mechanism for preventing over issuance. So basically, they can, the thing can be widely under collateralized if they let it be. One thing you could do is you could try to tie the interest to the relative market cap of how much extent stablecoin you have and how much of your market cap. So you could say, we're targeting to have 1/3 of our market cap should be in stablecoin, and the other 2/3 should be in the chain itself, and we'll adjust interest rates so that if somehow people draw too much UST, we'll lower the interest and we'll increase it if they don't draw enough. So you can do something like that, which might work better. You'll still have some issues around liquidity because you're giving people liquidity away for free, even though it has a cost. So I think there's some weird interactions here. I think you can take it down, but like they're big enough that if you actually want to take it down at a profit, you would need to have very, very deep pockets. So you've seen this with Soros and a pound. I think you can do probably something like this with Luna, but it would be quite expensive. Or you can you can wait until the hype dies down, and at some point, this thing kind of collapses by itself. But the weird thing is that no one cares. It's like so innovative. In terms of Rune and Sourcechain, so what Rune and Sourcechain what they do essentially is that they have a DEX, and I think they do some form of secure multi-party computation to do threshold signatures. So the validators of the Sourcechain basically hold in some form hold Bitcoin in a multi-sig. So if you want to deposit, you deposit Bitcoin to an address, it gets wrapped by the validators, and then you can trade this wrapped asset on their chain. The question is like, is this much more attractive to the average trader than wrapping it on BSC or wrapping it, as WBTC on some chain and using some form of DeFi. I don't know that DeFi users are that sensitive to use this. I think part of it is Eric Worse really liking the original Bitcoiners and trying to do something with their, and trying to like market to them. But I think they're fundamentally hostile to using anything else other than Bitcoin. So I don't know how that works out. But in general, I will say this: relying on your validator set to hold some form of multi of threshold signature for holding assets on another chain is not a bad idea. It's a valuable thing. It's a valuable thing to do. What's my elevator pitch of Tezos for someone who doesn't know anything about blockchains? Well, if for someone who knows nothing about blockchain, not even that they're a thing, it's going to be tough. In this case, I can tell them it's like I would say it's a decentralized software that lets you send payments to anyone in the world for low fees, and also build financial primitives. That's if they know nothing. If they vaguely heard of other chains, they know about Bitcoin, they know about Ethereum, they don't really know the technology. I would say that, well, it's very similar to Bitcoin and Ethereum, but the difference is that whereas the roadmap of Ethereum is closely linked to whereas the upgrades of Ethereum don't really have. Let me rephrase that. I would say it's very similar to Bitcoin and Ethereum, but that it has a way of upgrading itself so that the software can become better over time, and the decisions on how to upgrade is within the hand of its user base. What about using blockchain to verify authenticity of photos and videos to combat AI platform like deepfake? I don't think you can do that. That's the saying. It's like if you have let's say you have two photos. One is a deepfake. The other one is not. What is what is the blockchain going to bring to you? Like, you want some form of DRM, right? So let's say you convince every single camera maker that they should add a DRM chip that is going to sign the picture. First of all, it's going to be very hard to prevent people from reverse engineering the key. They're going to go inside of the hardware and they're going to find out the keys that is signing all these images as authentic. That's your first problem. It has happened time and time again. But let's say you get the hardware really right, and if anyone tampers with it, the key is destroyed. So you can't do that, and it also doesn't link from the industry. That's a tall tale. You still have the so-called analog hole, where I can make a deep fake and then take a picture of it with a real camera, and all of a sudden, it's signed, and now it's like, well, is it a real picture or not? Now, maybe the camera could take several pictures with different depths of field, so that it realizes that it's taking a picture of a picture versus a picture of a real 3D thing. And maybe because it's really, really hard to create like analog holograms, then it would help. But it's, at the end of the day, the blockchain has nothing to do with any of that. Like, sure, once you figure the very, very hard problem of actually signing authentic digital images, you can put something on a chain, but that's not really going to help you all that much. Do I foresee that Tezos could change its tokenomics to have a limited supply? Two questions here. Do I foresee that Tezos could change its tokenomics? Yes. Do I foresee that it could change it to have a limited supply? I said early on with Tezos is like, I considered having a limited supply just to satisfy people who want a limited supply. And in some sense, maybe we should do it. We just say like, okay, the limited, Tezos is limited to 1 trillion. There we go, limited supply. Check the box. And either enough to see that the limited supply, doesn't matter, in which case you don't care about this, or you think a limited supply matters, in which case you're like, oh, okay, it checks the box, limited supply, and you don't really think about what the number means. So maybe we could do that. It's a very populist thing to say like, look, we have a limited supply, like Avalanche does. It's just nonsense. But sure, you can have a limited supply. It doesn't do anything. But if enough people, fool themselves into thinking it matters, then maybe you should just have that for marketing reasons. The thing that the other tokenomics thing that I think is more relevant, I think, is delegation. So one possible change you can imagine in Tezos is basically saying, right now you have a fixed reward, right? So the chain inflates by 5.5% a year. one thing you could do is make that a function of how many people stake. So say on Tezos, about 10% is staked. And I'm talking about the bond, the Baker bond, the thing that's actually at risk, not the delegation, which is around 80%. So you say, okay, the rate is going to be 5.5% if 10% stake. But if bakers are willing to put a larger bond, you can say like, okay, we'll give bakers that put a larger bonds a little more blocks. And then you make it so that if 20% stake, then your inflation rate, instead of being like 5%, becomes 0.5% or 0.25% or even zero at some point. So once you do that, you get an interesting situation where bakers are going to say, wait a second, I can get more blocks by relying less on delegation and more on my own bond. So I'm going to put a larger bond so that I'm not as reliant on delegation. But now that drops the reward for everyone. You do a system like this, you still have some delegation, but you're going to end up with bakers competing to have a larger bond and have much lower rewards. So you would end up in a situation where basically you end up with an inflation rate of like maybe 1% or 0.5%. Now, of course, in that case, the bakers wouldn't be giving 90% away to the delegates. They would probably keep most of it for themselves because they need to cover their operations. So if you do that, you're less basically delegation becomes less important. So you do lose a bit of the relationship between the baker and the delegator. You gain a few things. You don't have any of you don't basically raise the tax question of the tax treatment of rewards, which is potentially interesting. There's an interesting court case in the US around it. But in general, you basically cut through the question because your inflation rate becomes very, very small and people don't really receive rewards anyway. So that's one benefit. You have better composability. You don't need stuff like CTES, for example. You can just use TES everywhere because the opportunity cost of not delegating TES becomes very, very low. You get a bigger bond on the chain. So those are the main benefits. The thing that you lose is that I would say you lose the... I think there's a lot of appeal for people to delegate and actually receive rewards, and that's still something that's appealing to people on the Tezos chain. So you lose that, and you lose a little bit of the social element of delegation, which is important. So if you ask me like what change of tokenomics would I, if there had to be a change in tokenomics in Tezos, what would I think would be the most interesting one? That would probably be this one. I think it'd be quite controversial though, because a lot of bakers are very focused on delegation, but it would make Tezos, I would say, more like Cosmos and more like Ethereum 2.0, for example, in this respect. There would still be delegation, but it would be a form of custodial delegation where somehow people go and actually like give lend their bonds to bakers where it's at risk, as opposed to a phenomenon where you're not where like delegation where the funds are not at risk. Fixed supply. Let's see, where was I? Tezos aims for scalability, and that's a very good point. But how can we continue to accept more transactions if the Tezos nodes developing a camel give a lot of performance problems? Well, the point of scaling is that the Tezos node is not the one processing the transaction. That's part of the point. The processing of transaction is offset to the rollup nodes. But I will also say that the fact that it's developing a camel is not the problem. You can write a lot of very high performance code in a camel. It's just that writing performance code in any language is difficult. So it doesn't really have to do with a camel here. It's a history of the thing was developed first and foremost to try and be correct and be bug free, and second to be performant. But that's not an interesting property of a camel. Shouldn't Tezos change its language and better support the Tezos distribution? So there's two parts here. One is a shell, and you have two shells for Tezos. We have Octez, which is a distribution including a shell, and then you have Tezos, which is written in Rust, and then you have the protocol itself, which is in Camel. So the shell hosts the protocol. So better support for Tezos, I think, is very important. I really like the Tezos shell, and so certainly we should keep improving the support for Tezos. But changing the language of the core protocol, I think, would be a massive endeavor, and I don't think there would be a lot of benefits to that. There's been a lot a lot of man hours invested in writing this protocol, and replacing it from scratch with a new one that hasn't been tested for several years. You need to show a very, very, very compelling reason to do that. And certainly scaling and performance is not one, because once you scale with rollups, you can write your rollup code in any language you want. It doesn't have to be a camel. And again, not that there's anything wrong with the performance of a camel. I mentioned on Twitter that the only token you'll need on layer 2 is Tezos. How exactly will that work, and what did you mean by that? So yeah, sure. So a lot of the companies building layer 2 solution on Ethereum raise money from VCs on the expectation that they're going to have a token, and so they have to basically put in a token. And the way the token works is that the credits token that is going to absorb transaction fees on a rollup. But that's not the case here. These rollups have to have a concept of gas, because even the rollup operator is limited in the number of transactions they can accept. So you end up having some form of congestion pricing even onto the rollup. But that pricing can be done purely in Tez. It doesn't have to be captured by another token. In fact, my general thinking on rollups is that even for the one built with a token, it's going to be hard for them to capture much value, because ultimately the congestion is going to come from more from the part of the congestion is going to come from the L1, in a sense that you have a limited number of transactions you can include in the blocks that are going to be done by the rollup. But imagining that you have this great data availability sampling layer, and you can put a ton of data to the rollup, and you're just limited by the speed of the rollup node, then you have to have some form of congestion limitation, and you can make that burning Tez, as opposed to burning some other token that belongs to some company. Will there be some privacy feature coming? So sampling, unfortunately, was missing a parameter to make it useful. So if you want to develop a safe sampling contract, in theory, you can do it with the old version, but it was really fraught with difficulty. So Jacquard has a fix for that. Another privacy feature we could have beyond that is a so-called multi-asset shielded pool, where instead of creating shielded pools per contract, per token, you have one giant shielded pool for all tickets on Tezos. It would be a really interesting development. We know how to do it, but there's limited amount of bandwidth in terms of engineering and in terms of merging everything into the main protocol. So it's definitely something that's interesting. I haven't seen a ton of demand unfortunately, for privacy. I mean, it's something that's quite dear to me on an analytical level, but in practice, if you look at what people are asking on blockchain today, it doesn't really come up as a very important feature for users. They should, but they don't. In what way do I envision the privacy feature of Tezos being used? I mean, in general, for transactions, I think I don't think that people should broadcast a transaction to the entire world. The nice thing about the privacy features that we have is that you can still audit it. So you have a viewing key, and you can have an audit trail. So it's perfectly it's perfectly possible for you to prove the provenance of your fund, to show all of this information, but it's opt-in. You don't have to provide this information. So I think that there's an explanation that needs to be done around this. It's not quite well understood, I would say, by the world at large, but it's useful. Do I have thought on Spicy Swap and Matter DeFi? Not particularly. I'm not as familiar with this project as I am with others, so I don't think I have anything very useful to say, unfortunately, at the moment. What media do I consume regularly? Podcasts, blogs. I read a lot of Twitter, and then I follow the links from Twitter, which end up on blogs. I don't listen to that many podcasts. Mostly, I read Twitter, Wikipedia, ArcSiv, and blog posts. What's next in the evolution of proof of stake and self-amending ledger? What's Tezos' proposition? I would say scaling is the next big scaling is the next big thing. And then after scaling, if there was still an open problem, I would say is further minimize the reliance on its majority assumption. The best scenario is that you have something that works, and and that only needs a single honest party or even no honest party. So no honesty assumption is ideal. It's not clear if or how it can be done, but that would be that would be what you can go to beyond scaling. 1 year ago, I posted a video titled "Stablecoins, No Convertibility, No Parity. What current stablecoin projects satisfy requirements?" You discussed in that video. To some extent, DAI, although I think I see. So first of all, stablecoins like USDC or USDT is satisfied in a very trivial way, in a sense that they are tokenizing a bank account and they're offering you convertibility. So assuming they do what they say that they do, that's a very trivial way to do it. If you're looking at the ones which are not based on tokenized bank accounts, so I would say DAI to some extent. I don't think it's complete because it doesn't support negative stability fees, which it needs to be able to support. Checker, and so to some extent you have these things as well with Use and Calibri, although they have the same problem as MakerDAO, which is that they don't support negative stability fees. What mistake do you think was made that had the highest cost to this project? I think we all know what that mistake was. Do I foresee air and space companies, SpaceX, use a blockchain in the future? In what way? I mean, they could always do commemorative NFTs, for example. That's an obvious one. But beyond that, like directly using blockchain is, I don't see like a massive use case. In general, this whole technology is useful when you have many different parties across the world who don't necessarily trust each other, who need to transact, who don't necessarily know each other. It seems very, very different from like the type of problems that you have as a space company. But I have never run a space company, so I don't know. We have a question in French, but I'll translate it. Don't you think that the lack of stablecoins, of recognized stablecoin like USDC natively on Tezos, is a negative for Tezos adoption? Yeah, of course I do. It would be much better to have USDC, but ultimately that is something that only Circle can decide, and it's not. It is unfortunately not up to me. How do I see private and public blockchains working together? There's an interesting thing where you basically have some actors who want to use a private blockchain. You give them a private blockchain, and then they say, "Oh, but we want to do public blockchain stuff," and then you transform their private blockchain into a federated sidechain. That's an interesting potential model. So I think that can be how people work. They start on some sort of parallel chain. And then they just and then they connect to the main chain and migrate their assets. I think that's part of the value prop of Cosmos in some sense, because it says, look, if you want to run your private chain, use the Tendermint SDK. It runs. It's the Cosmos SDK. It runs. You get your private chains. You can pick your validators, do whatever you want. But hey, by the way, if you like to connect to all these other blockchains, you can also do that. So having sidechains that do that and act, start as private chains and then connect to the general Tezos network is potentially interesting. What are the downsides of lowering storage costs on Tezos? Having storage costs on Tezos is one of the things that we do right that Ethereum does not do right. That's a big problem in Ethereum, which is state bloat, and they are trying to deal with it with stateless clients and with state rent and so on and so forth. The storage fee solution on Tezos is fairly simple and it works. So you should have it no matter what, right? The downside of lowering it is that you end up with a bigger state size, and a bigger state size means that it's more expensive to run a node. It can even affect, because your state becomes bigger, so it can even affect the performance of the nodes, because when it retrieves data, it has to retrieve data from a bigger tree. The upside, of course, is that if people want to deploy contracts or do things on the chain, then it's cheaper for them to do that. Again, I think that rollups address a lot of that, because rollup maintainers maintain their own state. Although I assume that most rollups will implement some form of storage fees inside of the rollup. In my opinion, what is the best book to learn about distributed system applied to blockchain and to learn about scalability techniques? Uh, I don't really know. The thing is, like, it's been moving so fast, and then people get book deals, and then and then it takes like 2 years to write a book. So you see books coming out, and they've been out for and they are outdated already. I generally recommend the Princeton Bitcoin books, the one by Arvin Naranayan. But I don't think it touches too much on scalability. Uh, I know that um, there's a lot of content that's not really, that's mostly in blog posts, not in books, that I would recommend. And some people are creating MOOCs and this type of work around it. So that can be useful. But mostly, people talk about what they're doing, but they also don't give too many details because they want to prevent competition. So sometimes you don't see the entire. Sometimes you don't see the entire story here. There's someone who's building a course on the topic. Let me just see if I can find it. It's sorry. I'll post it later. Follow my Twitter and I'll post it. I don't remember. I don't remember the link on top of my head. Where is still the weakest and can be improved upon 2022? Well, the thing is that Tezos is an entire ecosystem along with tooling, indexers. There's very few ecosystems which have built so much infrastructure around themselves as Tezos, but it's also a different ecosystem from the rest. And the fact the cost of actually maintaining an entire ecosystem as opposed to basically piggybacking on another ecosystem is of course quite high, but it also points to capabilities. We can do things in our ecosystem that would be very hard for other people to do. But the weakest, I would say, is probably in the number of projects building on Tezos. It's been growing a lot in the past year, which is a great sign. But I think we need to see even further growth in the number of applications and companies built on Tezos. Someone asks that Cassian and I were fan of Milton Friedman. What other economists do I like? I mean, there's just one article that I mentioned. I like Milton Friedman, and fandom is a big word. I like his son as well, David Friedman. He's very, he has very clear writing on price theory. I like also Friedrich Hayek, Murray Rothbard, a bunch of the usual suspects in the space. Someone is just joining the AMA, is not sure whether I responded. What can we do to attract more developers? Aside from having nice cookies, I would say hackathons are usually helpful. Although you run a hackathon and you'll find some people who are basically professional hackathon participants. Those exist. You need to give good developer toolings, a strong community, a strong user base, and a compelling reason to build on Tezos, because you're building on Tezos, you're making a choice, you're committing to an ecosystem that's kind of different from the rest. So you can do it out of you can do it because you love the developer tooling so much. We do have really good developer tooling on Tezos. You can do it because you like the community. You can do it because it's the you want to interact with another project that's there. So there's a whole lot of reason, and I would say it's like, look at the existing developers, look at the reasons why they're on Tezos, and then double down on the things that attracted them to the ecosystem in the first place. Talk to the developers, see what pain points that they have, and basically try to fix the pain points that are present here. Do I still think that the mini blockchain has technology worth integrating in Tezos at some point? I mean, the main thing you can do with the mini blockchain is you can look at it almost as a ZK rollup, right? It is essentially that. So ZK rollups are not new. There's now a few of them, but yeah, taking the mini code and using it as a ZK rollup is interesting. I do like optimistic rollups a lot today because there are still a lot of competing challenges associated with ZK rollups. I proposed them a while back, but it's, even though you can parallelize them, it's hard to justify spending 1,000x the compute for running a ZK rollup node as it is to spending only 1 exacompute to run an optimistic rollup node. You get better security properties with zk rollup, but it comes at a very, very high cost. I mentioned in a recent interview that I like to that I expect to see more consolidation in the industry. What does that look like? Yeah, I think that looks like mostly the chains that have some adoption consolidating their adoption and seeing more concentration of projects on the same chains. Why do I block so many people on Twitter? I tend to block people when they do off-topic replies. So if I'm talking about, I don't know, if I'm having a conversation about marsupials and then someone come in and says, "When will Tezos get you, USD coin?" It's auto block because I'm trying to have a conversation with someone and you bring up something unrelated. So I don't know why, or if you interact with trolls and support Tezos trolls in general, that's also an auto block. It makes my Twitter experience more pleasant, and I think it's important that I'm on Twitter. So thanks for joining me here. I look forward to do more of those in the future. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter, but please don't do off-topic replies. And you can get notifications for the next AMA. And of course, follow the Tezos social channels for all kind of account updates for the ecosystem. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.